Northern Iceland, winter of 974 AD. Inside a sealed longhouse, 40 Norse warriors form a circle around something that shouldn't exist in Viking society. A man dressed in the ceremonial robes of a Velva, a female seer, preparing to perform seether magic. But this isn't about clothing. What happens next will involve rituals so fundamentally violating to Norse concepts of masculinity that the sagas refuse to describe them directly, using terms that were considered so insulting that merely speaking them justified immediate blood vengeance. The man is Eyjolf the Red. 6 months ago, he was a respected warrior who had killed 12 men in honorable combat. Tonight, he will undergo a transformation that will grant him the power to see the future, to curse enemies with madness, to bless crops with abundance. The price for this power? He will cease to be considered a man in Viking society. He will exist in a third category, neither male nor female, simultaneously revered for his abilities and reviled for what he had to become to obtain them. The 40 witnesses aren't here by choice. Each has been selected because they possess something Eyjolf needs: knowledge, alliances, or simply the ability to generate the emotional energy that seether magic requires. After tonight, they will be bound to him through shared participation in ceremonies that, if revealed, would result in the Blood Eagle execution, where ribs are separated from the spine and pulled outward to resemble wings while the victim still breathes. This is the real Viking age that your history teachers never mentioned, where power came through violations of every social norm, where gods demanded acts that even the Vikings found difficult to discuss, where entire communities participated in rituals that required them to break the boundaries between human and animal, between living and dead, between sacred and profane. Tonight, you'll discover the ceremonies that Vikings themselves tried to erase from memory, the rituals that Christian chroniclers witnessed and declared literally demonic, the practices that were whispered about in the darkest corners of mead halls but never spoken of in daylight. These aren't the Vikings of popular culture. These are the practitioners of arts so dark that even their own culture struggled to accept them. Before diving into these forgotten stories, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you are listening from. I find it incredible that we are exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Every 9 years, something happened at the Temple of Uppsala in Sweden that made hardened warriors weep and foreign merchants flee in terror. The great Adam of Bremen, writing in 1070 from eyewitness accounts, dedicated pages to describing what he witnessed before, ultimately concluding that certain details were too horrific for Christian readers to endure. What could make a medieval chronicler, a man accustomed to plague, warfare, and public executions, declare something too terrible to fully document? The ceremony began when Sweden plunged into the darkness of winter solstice, as if the sun itself refused to witness what would unfold over the next 9 days. This wasn't a simple sacrifice. This was a transformation of the sacred grove into something that challenged the boundaries between worship and atrocity, between devotion and madness. Let me tell you about 3 people whose stories intersected at Uppsala in the winter of 852 AD, because their fates illustrate exactly what these ceremonies demanded from participants, witnesses, and victims alike. First, there was Asa, 17 years old, daughter of a wealthy merchant from Birka. She had been selected 3 months before the ceremony, not because she had committed any crime, but because she was perfect, unmarked skin that had never known hardship, virgin status confirmed by the community's older women, noble birth that made her valuable to the gods. The goddess Freyja, they said, deserved quality offerings, and Asa represented the best humanity could offer. For 3 months before the ceremony, Asa lived in a special house near the temple. Every morning, she underwent purification rituals that went far beyond simple bathing. She would be submerged in tubs filled with milk from cattle that had been fed sacred herbs. Honey from bees that nested in the temple walls would be mixed into the milk, creating a substance that was believed to preserve her purity while preparing her for divine transformation. Her skin became so sensitive from these treatments that even light touch would leave marks, which the priests considered evidence of her increasing receptivity to divine presence. The education she received during these months was perhaps the most disturbing aspect. Asa was taught to sing her own funeral songs, practicing the notes she would need to maintain while dying. The priests would simulate the hanging that awaited her, teaching her to control her voice even as ropes constricted her throat. They believed that sacrifices who sang during their death created a bridge between mortal and divine realms. The songs weren't random, but carefully composed prayers that could only be properly delivered by someone experiencing the transition from life to death. The second person was Magnus, a priest of Odin who had served at Uppsala for 20 years. He had overseen dozens of these 9-year ceremonies, each time selecting and preparing the human sacrifices that would hang from the sacred trees. Magnus kept detailed records, which survived in fragments, describing not just the rituals, but his own increasing discomfort with what his role required. By 852, his writings suggest a man struggling with the weight of what he had done in service to his gods. Magnus wrote about the selection process with clinical detachment that barely concealed his horror. The human sacrifices weren't chosen randomly. Each god required specific types of offerings. Odin demanded warriors who had shown cowardice in battle, their sacrifice a final chance at redemption. Thor required those who had broken oaths, their death restoring cosmic balance. Freyja wanted the beautiful and innocent, their purity a gift to the goddess of fertility. The selection process involved the entire community nominating candidates, creating a system where sacrifice became a tool for settling scores and eliminating rivals. The third person was Eric, a Christian merchant from Denmark who had the misfortune of arriving at Uppsala 3 days into the ceremony. His account, preserved in a monastery in France where he fled after escaping, provides an outsider's perspective on rituals that Vikings had normalized through centuries of practice. Eric's descriptions are valuable precisely because he lacked the cultural conditioning that allowed Vikings to witness these ceremonies without psychological collapse. Eric wrote about entering the sacred grove and finding it transformed into something from a nightmare. Every tree bore fruit of flesh. Human bodies hung alongside horses, dogs, and other animals, all at varying stages of decay. The fresher corpses still moved slightly in the wind, creating an illusion of life. The older ones had been partially consumed by birds, despite guards stationed to prevent scavengers from stealing sacred flesh. The smell, Eric wrote, was beyond description, a mixture of decay, incense, and something else he could only describe as the scent of evil itself. But it was the living participants that most disturbed Eric. He described crowds of Vikings standing beneath the hanging bodies, arms raised in worship, catching drops of blood and other fluids that fell from the corpses. Parents lifted children to get better views. Pregnant women rubbed their bellies against trees where sacrifices hung, believing it would transfer divine blessing to their unborn. Young couples copulated beneath the corpses, their unions blessed by the presence of those transitioning between life and death. The actual hanging ceremony was choreographed with precision that revealed centuries of refinement. Victims weren't simply hanged to die quickly. They were positioned at specific heights calculated to prolong the dying process. Too high and the neck would break, ending suffering too quickly. Too low and they might touch ground, profaning the sacrifice. The perfect height allowed them to barely reach the platform with extended toes, creating a situation where they could postpone death through effort but never prevent it. Asa's hanging took place on the 5th day of the ceremony. She walked to the grove, naked except for a crown of mistletoe and holly, plants sacred to Freya. The crowd parted as she passed, some reaching out to touch her, believing her divinity was already manifesting. She climbed the platform that had been built around an ancient oak, a tree so old that Vikings believed it had stood since the world's creation. The rope used was silk-dyed purple, with crushed shells imported from Byzantium. Even the instrument of death was luxurious, befitting a gift to the goddess. As they positioned the rope around Asa's neck, she began singing the death song she had practiced. Her voice, clear and strong initially, would gradually weaken over the next hour as the rope slowly constricted her breathing. The transformation of her voice from human to something otherworldly was considered the moment when Freya accepted the sacrifice. While Asa hung, slowly strangling, the secondary rituals began. Priests would approach with sacred spears, not to kill but to create small wounds that would bleed in patterns down her body. The blood was collected in bowls made from human skulls, particularly skulls of previous priests who had requested their remains be used in this manner. The collected blood would be mixed with mead and consumed by the priests, creating a communion between living and dying, mortal and divine. Magnus wrote about his role in these secondary rituals with increasing distress as years passed. He described having to perform acts on the hanging victims that he could only refer to obliquely, using terms like opening the sacred channels and creating divine receptivity. These acts, performed while victims still lived, were believed to facilitate the transfer of their souls to the gods. Magnus's later writings suggest deep trauma from decades of performing these rituals, culminating in his eventual disappearance from Uppsala records. Meanwhile, 8 other humans hung nearby in various stages of death. A captured Saxon priest who had tried to convert Vikings to Christianity, his death a message to the White Christ. Twin boys, no older than 10, selected because their identical appearance supposedly doubled the power of their sacrifice. A pregnant woman whose unborn child counted as a separate offering. An elderly wise woman who had volunteered, believing death at Uppsala would grant her eternal wisdom. Each sacrifice received specific treatment while dying. The Saxon priest had his tongue cut out to prevent him from calling on Christ. The twin boys were positioned to face each other, forced to watch each other's slow death. The pregnant woman's belly was painted with runes that supposedly transferred the baby's soul directly to Frigg, wife of Odin. The elderly woman had her eyes replaced with sacred stones while she still lived, transforming her into a seeing corpse that would prophesy until breath finally failed. Eric's account describes the crowd's behavior during these deaths with horrified fascination. They would cheer when victims convulsed, interpreting spasms as divine possession. They would fall silent when victims went still, believing the gods were speaking through the silence. Children were encouraged to throw flowers at the hanging bodies, each successful hit considered a blessing for the child's future. Women who were menstruating were brought forward to stand beneath female sacrifices, the mixing of menstrual blood with sacrifice blood, creating a powerful magical combination. The trees themselves were considered transformed by the ritual. The sap that ran red from absorbing blood was collected for use in magical preparations. Bark stained with human fluids was harvested for healing potions. The roots, fed by decomposing sacrifices from centuries of ceremonies, were believed to reach all the way to the underworld. Eating fruit from these trees was both sacred and forbidden, granting visions but cursing the eater with seeing too much truth about the nature of existence. King Damalda's story illustrates the ultimate price of Uppsala. In 650 AD, Sweden had endured 3 years of famine. The first year, they sacrificed criminals and foreign slaves. The gods remained unsatisfied, and crops continued to fail. The second year, they sacrificed nobles and even priests, including volunteers who believed their willing deaths would appease divine anger. The famine worsened, and people began eating leather, bark, and eventually each other. The third year, the remaining priests declared that only royal blood would suffice. King Damalde, facing the complete collapse of his kingdom, agreed to be sacrificed. But his death wouldn't be a simple hanging. As king, he required a ceremony that matched his status. For 9 days before his hanging, pieces of his flesh were cut from his body and burned as offerings. Small pieces initially, then larger, until by the 9th day he was more wound than man. Only then was he hanged from the central oak, his mutilated body swaying above his 6-year-old son who would inherit both crown and the knowledge of what kingship might ultimately demand. The economic impact of Uppsala's ceremonies was staggering. Every 9 years, the surrounding regions had to provide not just sacrifices but support for thousands of witnesses, priests, and participants. Entire harvests were consumed in feasting. Wealth equivalent to years of trade was burned or buried as offerings. The human cost went beyond those sacrificed to include families destroyed, communities depopulated, and bloodlines ended forever. Yet, participation was considered mandatory. Those who refused to attend or contribute faced accusations of impiety that could result in outlawry or worse. The social pressure to not just witness but celebrate these deaths created a culture where atrocity became normalized, even celebrated. Children who grew up attending Uppsala ceremonies every 9 years became adults who saw human sacrifice as natural as seasonal changes. The psychological techniques used at Uppsala reveal sophisticated understanding of crowd manipulation and trauma bonding. By requiring entire communities to participate, witness, and even celebrate these sacrifices, the priests created shared complicity that bound people together. Everyone had blood on their hands, literally or figuratively. Everyone had cheered while innocents died. This shared guilt created a powerful social cohesion that made questioning the rituals feel like betraying not just the gods but the entire community. The transformation of Uppsala during these ceremonies went beyond the physical. Witnesses described a change in the very air, becoming thick and difficult to breathe. Colors seemed more vivid, as if the blood and death had awakened something in the land itself. Sounds carried differently, with some claiming they could hear the gods speaking through the wind in the trees. Whether this was mass hallucination brought on by smoke from burning herbs, the psychological impact of witnessing mass death, or something genuinely supernatural remains debated. The creation of a berserker began not with warrior training, but with the systematic destruction of human identity. The process started with boys as young as 7, selected not for their aggression, but for a particular type of emptiness behind their eyes. The recruiters looked for children who could skin a rabbit without expression, who could watch suffering without flinching, who seemed to exist at a remove from normal human emotion. These weren't psychopaths in the modern sense, but children whose souls seemed loosely attached to their bodies, ready to be separated and replaced with something else. Let me tell you about Thorvald's transformation, because his journey from human child to something that existed between man and beast illustrates the full horror of berserker creation. Thorvald was 8 when they came for him. His father had noticed concerning signs. The boy would stand in freezing rain for hours, testing his endurance. He would catch birds and methodically remove their feathers, not from cruelty, but from curiosity about the exact moment when they accepted death. He showed no fear of pain, once holding his hand over a candle flame until the flesh charred, just to understand what his body could endure. These weren't signs of toughness, but of a dangerous disconnection from normal human sensation. The berserker trainers arrived at night, as they always did. Thorvald's mother tried to hide him, but resistance was futile. The boy was marked for transformation, and fighting it would only result in the entire family being outlawed. His last night in human society was spent in tears, not his own but his family's. Thorvald watched them weep with the same detachment he had shown watching birds die. He was already halfway to becoming what they needed. The journey to the wolf camps took 3 days through dense forest. These camps were located in places even experienced hunters avoided, not from fear of wolves, but from fear of what they might witness. The first lesson began immediately. Thorvald was stripped of his clothes and name. He would be called Whelp until he earned a new identity through transformation. The clothes were burned in front of him, a symbolic destruction of his human past. The initial phase of berserker training involved breaking down human behavior patterns and replacing them with animal instincts. Thorvald spent his first month in a pit that had been specially constructed for this purpose. It was deep enough that he couldn't climb out, narrow enough that he couldn't lie down, dark enough that day and night became meaningless. Food was thrown down at irregular intervals, raw meat, sometimes fresh, sometimes rotting, sometimes still attached to living animals he had to kill in the confined space. Language was the first human trait to disappear. If Thorvald spoke, the pit would be flooded with a mixture of water and wolf urine until he nearly drowned. After the third flooding, he stopped trying to speak. After the 10th, he had forgotten that speech was something he had ever been capable of. The trainers would lower into the pit recordings of wolf vocalizations, and Thorvald had to learn to reproduce them perfectly. A wrong sound meant no food. A correct howl meant meat. But the physical transformation was only the beginning. The psychological reshaping of berserkers involved techniques that wouldn't be formally understood until modern behavioral psychology rediscovered them centuries later. They used systematic desensitization to remove fear responses. Thorvald would be exposed to increasingly intense stimuli while in states of deep relaxation induced by specific breathing techniques and mild poisoning that created dissociative states. Spiders, then snakes, then wolves, then armed warriors. By the end, nothing could trigger a fear response. They used operant conditioning to create new behavioral patterns. Violent actions were rewarded with food, comfort, and eventually with chemical substances that triggered pleasure responses in the brain. Peaceful behaviors were punished with pain, isolation, and withdrawal of the substances that his body had become dependent on. Within months, Thorvald's nervous system had been rewired to experience violence as pleasure and peace as pain. The chemical transformation of berserkers involved substances that modern science is only beginning to understand. The base was Amanita muscaria, the red and white spotted mushroom that appears in fairy tales for good reason. But the Vikings had discovered that the mushroom's psychoactive properties could be concentrated and refined through a process that seems impossible, but has been confirmed through chemical analysis of residues found at berserker training sites. The process worked like this. Reindeer would eat the mushrooms, their digestive systems breaking down toxic compounds while concentrating psychoactive ones. The berserker trainees would then consume the reindeer urine, which sounds revolting but was actually sophisticated pharmacology. The human digestive system would further refine the compounds. Senior berserkers would then consume the trainees' urine, creating a third level of refinement. This thrice-processed fluid would then be fed back to the trainees, creating a substance so potent that a single dose could permanently alter brain chemistry. The effects were cumulative and irreversible. After months of consumption, neural pathways would restructure. The amygdala, which processes fear, would atrophy. The prefrontal cortex, which governs impulse control, would shrink. Meanwhile, the areas controlling aggression and physical capability would expand. Brain scans of modern descendants of known berserker bloodlines show unusual structures that suggest these changes became heritable. The integration with wolf packs was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of berserker training. This wasn't metaphorical or symbolic. The boys had to be genuinely accepted by wild wolf packs as pack members. This required months of preparation, learning to move, smell, and behave in ways that wolves would recognize as familiar rather than threatening. Thorvald's integration began with scent transformation. He would roll in wolf feces and urine daily until his human scent was completely masked. He would eat the same diet as wolves: raw meat, organs, and partially digested vegetation from prey stomachs. His body odor changed, becoming something neither human nor wolf, but compatible with both. When finally introduced to a pack, he had to demonstrate complete submission, exposing his throat and belly, allowing himself to be bitten and mounted without resistance. Living with the pack required constant reinforcement of his position as the lowest member. He ate last, getting only scraps after every wolf had fed. He slept on the periphery, exposed to cold and predators. He had to participate in hunts, despite lacking the teeth and claws that made wolves effective predators. But gradually, something shifted. The wolves began treating him less as an interloper and more as a disabled pack member who needed protection. The bonding process with wolves went beyond simple cohabitation. Thorvald learned to understand their complex social communications, the subtle ear positions that indicated mood, the variety of vocalizations that conveyed specific information, the scent markings that told stories of territory and hierarchy. He began thinking in wolf concepts, dreaming in wolf experiences, processing the world through wolf perception. The first human kill was a carefully orchestrated ritual that marked the transition from training to active berserker status. But this wasn't death in battle. The victim had to be someone from the trainee's former life, someone who represented their human past. For Thorvald, they brought his younger sister, 6-year-old Astrid. The killing had to be done without weapons, using only teeth and hands, mimicking how wolves kill. The trainers considered it essential that the berserker experience the intimacy of killing with their body, feeling life end through direct contact. The psychological impact of killing a loved one while in a chemically altered state created a fracture in consciousness that could never fully heal. Berserkers would later describe experiencing themselves from outside their bodies during these kills, watching themselves commit acts they couldn't control or prevent. This dissociative state became permanent, allowing them to commit atrocities without psychological consequence because they experienced themselves as observers rather than actors. The physical transformation of berserkers was dramatic and partially irreversible. After a year of training, their muscle density increased by up to 40% without corresponding weight gain. Their body temperature ran several degrees higher than normal, allowing them to fight naked in winter. Their pain response disappeared almost entirely. They could suffer wounds that would incapacitate normal humans and continue fighting. Their digestive systems adapted to raw meat, losing the ability to process cooked food. The berserker rage itself was more than simple battle fury. Witnesses described transformations that seemed to defy physical laws. Bodies would swell with muscle that hadn't existed moments before. Faces would distort into configurations that didn't seem humanly possible. Some accounts describe berserkers continuing to fight after receiving fatal wounds, their bodies operating on something beyond normal biological processes. One berserker allegedly fought for several minutes after being decapitated, though this might refer to partial decapitation, where the spine was severed, but some tissue remained connected. Between battles, berserkers existed in a twilight state that wasn't quite human consciousness. They required constant management by handlers who understood their altered nature. They would be housed in special quarters, often underground, where their needs could be met without risk to normal society. They were fed specific diets that maintained their altered brain chemistry without triggering full berserker rage. They were provided with captured enemies to hunt in controlled environments, maintaining their killing skills without endangering allies. The handlers of berserkers were specialists who understood that these weren't warriors in any traditional sense, but weapons that happened to be shaped like humans. They knew how to read the subtle signs that preceded transformation, the way breathing would deepen, how pupils would dilate, the specific muscle tension that indicated imminent rage. They could sometimes prevent unwanted transformations through careful application of calming techniques involving specific scents, sounds, and touch patterns that had been programmed during training. The carnal behavior of berserkers reflected their transformed nature. They didn't distinguish between human and animal, male and female, living and recently dead. In their altered state, they would attempt to mate with anything that moved, and some things that didn't. After battles, they had to be restrained until the rage passed, or they would assault anyone nearby, regardless of previous relationship. This wasn't criminal behavior in the modern sense, but the expression of consciousness that no longer recognized human categories or boundaries. The end of a berserker's career was usually tragic. The constant chemical alteration, repeated head trauma, and psychological strain of existing between human and animal consciousness created progressive neurological damage. Older berserkers would begin transforming without chemical triggers, shifting into rage states randomly. They would attack friends and enemies without discrimination. Most were eventually killed by their own communities when they became too dangerous to control. Some were given what Vikings called the final hunt. They would be released into the forests where they had trained, naked and without supplies, to die as they had lived, between species. If the wolf packs they had lived with accepted them back, they might survive for months or years as pack members. If not, they would die alone, belonging neither to human nor animal society. Their bodies, if found, would be burned rather than given proper burial, their spirits considered too dangerous for any afterlife that involved other souls. Blood brotherhood among Vikings went far beyond the romantic notion of warriors cutting palms and shaking hands. The blood oath ceremonies created biological and psychological connections between participants that modern science is only beginning to understand. These rituals merged individual consciousness into collective awareness, destroyed personal boundaries, and created groups of warriors who functioned as single organisms with multiple bodies. The most complete account of a blood oath ceremony comes from the Orkneyinga saga, which describes how Jarl Ragnvald and 11 of his captains bound themselves before their raid on Byzantium in 1015. The description is clinical in its detail, suggesting the author either witnessed the ceremony or interviewed participants. What it reveals is a process that transformed 12 individuals into something that transcended normal human connection. The preparation for blood oath ceremonies began months in advance. Each participant had to achieve a state of physical and mental purity that went beyond simple health. They would fast for extended periods, breaking fasts only with specific foods believed to thin the blood and increase its magical potency. They would abstain from sexual contact, allowing what Vikings called life force to build up in their bodies. They would undergo purification rituals involving sweat lodges, ice baths, and consumption of mildly toxic herbs that supposedly cleansed impurities from blood and consciousness. The location for blood oath ceremonies was chosen with extreme care. It needed to be a place of power, usually where violence had occurred, where boundaries between worlds were considered thin. Battlefields where many had died were preferred. Execution grounds were acceptable. Places where murders had occurred were particularly valued. The spilled blood of previous violence was believed to have prepared the ground for the magical working that would bind the oath-takers. The timing mattered as much as the location. Blood oaths were ideally sworn during liminal periods when normal rules were suspended. Dawn and dusk were common choices. The moments of seasonal transition, equinoxes and solstices, were considered particularly powerful. Some groups would wait for specific astronomical alignments, believing that cosmic forces would strengthen their bonds. The full moon was avoided, as its power was considered too chaotic for the precise magic of blood bonding. On the night of Ragnvald's oath, the 12 men gathered in a grove where a mass execution had taken place years before. They had been fasting for 3 days, drinking only water mixed with small amounts of poisonous mushrooms that created a state of heightened awareness and reduced ego boundaries. They arrived naked, having shed all symbols of individual identity. Their bodies were painted with runes, using a mixture of their own feces, urine, and menstrual blood from women who had contributed to the ritual. The ceremony began with the creation of sacred space. The men formed a circle, and at the cardinal points, they placed objects of power, weapons that had killed enemies, bones of ancestors, soil from their birthplaces, and most importantly, a skull that would serve as the vessel for their mixed blood. This skull had been specially prepared, lined with silver, and inscribed with runes that described the consequences of oath-breaking. It had belonged to a previous oath-breaker, his head taken as a warning to future generations. Each man then had to provide blood from specific locations on his body, each cut representing different aspects of the oath. Blood from the forehead represented thoughts and loyalty of mind. Blood from over the heart represented emotional bonds and courage. Blood from the sword, hand, represented shared violence and mutual defense. Blood from the thigh represented speed and the promise to come when called. And blood from the genitals represented the sharing of life force and fertility, the promise that children of one would be protected by all. The amount of blood drawn was precisely measured. Too little, and the bond would be weak. Too much, and participants might die before the ceremony completed. The blood was collected in the skull bowl, where it mixed with other substances that enhanced its binding properties. These included saliva, collected during states of battle rage, tears gathered during moments of greatest sorrow, and sexual fluids collected at climax. These bodily fluids were believed to carry the essence of extreme emotional states, and consuming them would allow participants to share these experiences. But the most powerful addition to the blood mixture was a fungus that grew only on the bodies of hanged men. This fungus, which modern analysis suggests contained compounds similar to psilocybin, but with additional alkaloids unique to corpse decomposition, created temporary telepathic connections between those who consumed it. Viking texts describe participants suddenly experiencing memories that weren't their own, feeling emotions from other bodies, knowing thoughts before they were spoken. When the blood mixture was complete, it had to be consumed in a specific manner. The skull bowl would pass sunrise, the direction of increasing power. Each man would drink deeply, consuming not just blood, but the essence of his oath brothers. As the mixture entered their systems, witnesses outside the circle reported strange phenomena. The men would begin breathing in perfect synchronization. Their heartbeats would align. They would move as one without verbal communication. The psychological effects began within minutes. Participants would later describe feeling their individual consciousness dissolving, replaced by awareness that encompassed all 12 bodies. They could feel injuries that others had sustained years before. They experienced memories of childhoods they hadn't lived. Most disturbing, they felt the deaths of oath brothers who had participated in previous ceremonies, as if the blood itself carried memories of past bonds. This is when the most intense part of the ceremony began. In their merged state, the men would share their deepest secrets, greatest shames, and most hidden desires. But they didn't simply speak them. Each man experienced the other's secrets as if they were his own memories. Ragnvald felt what it was like to be Thorstein when he had murdered his brother for inheritance. Thorstein experienced Ragnvald's memory of an encounter with his own sister during a drunken feast. Every secret was shared, every shame experienced collectively, creating a situation where betrayal became psychologically impossible because each man's secrets were now held by all. The physical positioning during this phase created what saga writers called the Wheel of Flesh. The 12 men would arrange themselves in a circle, each connected to the next through specific physical contact that removed individual boundaries. Archaeological excavations of sites believed to be blood oath locations have found circular platforms with 12 positions, channels carved between them to allow fluids to flow from one position to the next. The men would remain in this formation for hours, some accounts say days, until the boundaries between individual bodies became meaningless. The sexual component of blood oath ceremonies is consistently mentioned, but never explicitly detailed in sagas. Terms like becoming one flesh and knowing each other as Adam knew Eve suggest intimate physical connection, but the specific acts remain unclear. What is clear is that these acts serve to completely eliminate personal boundaries. After a blood oath ceremony, the men knew each other in ways that transcended any normal human relationship. The bond created by these ceremonies had practical effects that went beyond symbolism. Oath brothers could sense each other's location over vast distances. They would know when one was in danger, feeling a physical pull toward their oath brother's location. They would experience each other's wounds, developing stigmata-like marks when an oath brother was injured far away. Most remarkably, they would sometimes experience each other's deaths, feeling what it was like to die while remaining alive. This connection made blood-bonded groups devastating in battle. They moved with perfect coordination without need for verbal commands. They knew instinctively where each other would be, allowing for complex tactics that seemed rehearsed but were actually spontaneous. They could feel when one of their number was struggling and would respond instantly, appearing wherever they were needed most. Enemies reported that fighting blood-bonded Vikings was like fighting a single creature with multiple bodies. The economic implications of blood bonds were significant. Oath brothers shared everything: wealth, property, women, children. If one died, the others would care for his family as their own. If one succeeded, all benefited. This created economic units that could accumulate and preserve wealth more effectively than individual warriors. Some of the great Viking fortunes were built by blood-bonded groups who pooled resources and opportunities. But the psychological cost was enormous. Living with 11 other consciousness, constantly present in your mind, created strain that many couldn't endure. Some oath brothers went mad from the constant input of others' thoughts and emotions. Others became unable to function as individuals, requiring the presence of their oath brothers to make even simple decisions. The bond that made them invincible in battle made them incomplete as individual humans. The breaking of a blood oath, whether through betrayal or attempted withdrawal, had consequences that went beyond social shame. Oathbreakers reported physical pain that felt like their blood was boiling in their veins. They would age rapidly, sometimes decades in months. They experienced hallucinations of their betrayed oath brothers, even those still living. Some died from no apparent cause other than the severing of the bond, their bodies simply ceasing to function without the connection that had become essential to their existence. When blood-bonded warriors died, the survivors experienced the death as if it were their own. They felt the sword entering flesh, the breath leaving lungs, the consciousness fading to nothing. This experience of death while remaining alive changed them fundamentally. They lost fear of death, having already experienced it. But they also lost some essential quality of life, becoming hollow, seeking their own deaths to rejoin their fallen brothers. Ragnvald's group succeeded in their raid on Byzantium, accumulating wealth that made them all rich beyond imagination. But within 5 years, all 12 were dead. 3 died in a single battle, and the other 9 experienced their death so intensely that they collapsed on the battlefield, helpless as they felt their own throats being cut, their own organs failing. The surviving 9 were never the same, having experienced death 3 times while remaining alive. They became increasingly reckless, seeking death to rejoin their fallen brothers. Within a year, all were dead, some in battle, some by suicide, some by simply willing themselves to stop living. The connection between agricultural success and human sexuality was fundamental to Viking cosmology. They believed that human sexual energy could be transferred to the land, that the fertility of women could be shared with fields, that the potency of men could strengthen crops. These weren't metaphorical connections, but literal magical operations that required specific rituals, many of which challenged every boundary of acceptable behavior, even in Viking society. The most documented fertility ritual was the annual Wedding of the Field that took place during spring planting across Scandinavia. This ceremony required newly married couples to consummate their unions publicly in freshly plowed furrows, while the entire community watched and participated. But to understand why Vikings considered this essential rather than perverted, We need to understand their conception of fertility as a force that could be directed, amplified, and transferred through human action. The preparation for field weddings began with the selection of couples. Not every married pair was suitable. The couples needed to be young, healthy, and preferably already proven fertile through pregnancy. They would undergo purification rituals that included fasting, bathing in sacred springs, and consumption of foods believed to increase sexual potency. The night before the ceremony, they would be separated, building sexual tension that would be released into the soil. The field itself required preparation beyond simple plowing. The furrows would be arranged in patterns that supposedly channeled sexual energy into the earth. Offerings would be buried at cardinal points. The sexual organs of sacrificed animals, menstrual blood mixed with semen, and occasionally the bodies of infants who had died naturally, their potential life force given to the earth. The field would be marked with poles topped with carved representations of genitals, marking it as sacred space where normal social rules were suspended. On the morning of the planting ceremony, the entire community would gather at the field's edge. Musicians would play drums and horns in rhythms that supposedly matched the earth's heartbeat. Priests would burn herbs that created smoke believed to carry prayers to Freyr and Freya, the twin gods of fertility. The crowd would begin chanting, simple, repetitive phrases that created a hypnotic atmosphere where individual consciousness began to blur into collective experience. The couples would enter the field naked, except for wreaths of grain stalks from the previous harvest, connecting past and future fertility. They would walk the field's boundaries, the women scattering seeds, while the men followed behind with wooden phalluses that they would use to press the seeds into the earth. This preliminary ritual was symbolic but essential, establishing the field as space where human and agricultural fertility would merge. Then came the actual consummation. Each couple would position themselves in a furrow, the woman below in direct contact with the soil, the man above. The crowd would cheer and sing, their voices covering any sounds of discomfort or embarrassment from the couples. The act had to be completed to climax, with the man withdrawing at the last moment to divide his seed between the woman and the earth. This division was crucial. Giving everything to either human or soil would unbalance the magic. But the couples were just the beginning. After they finished, other members of the community would add their own contributions. Men would masturbate onto the field, their seed mixing with the planted grain. Women who were menstruating would squat over the furrows, their blood feeding the earth. Pregnant women would lie in the furrows, their bellies pressed to the soil, transferring life force from fetus to field. Even children participated, spitting into the furrows, adding their saliva to the mixture of fluids that would supposedly ensure abundant harvest. The elderly had a special role in fertility rituals. Those past reproductive age were believed to have accumulated sexual energy that could be released all at once. Old men would be stimulated by younger women until they achieved erection, then would ejaculate onto the field, their lifetime of potency given to the crops. Old women would be penetrated with wooden phalluses carved from last year's grain stalks, their bodies serving as conduits between past and future harvests. Animals were integrated into fertility rituals in ways that went beyond sacrifice. The Great Horse Ritual, recorded in multiple sources, involved a white stallion that would be fed aphrodisiacs and brought to the field in a state of extreme arousal. A woman, usually a priestess of Freya, would position herself to receive the horse's seed, though actual penetration was avoided through careful positioning and barriers. The horse would be stimulated to completion, its semen collected and mixed with grain seed before planting. This wasn't bestiality in the modern sense, but a magical operation where the horse served as vessel for Freyr's divine potency. The grain baby tradition represented the darkest aspect of fertility magic. A child would be conceived during the spring planting ceremony, the parents chosen for their physical perfection and proven fertility. The mother would be monitored throughout pregnancy, fed special foods, kept from any contact with death or violence that might taint the child. The baby would be born during harvest, celebrated by the community as the personification of the field's fertility. But this child's fate was sealed from conception. After living for exactly 1 year, experiencing one complete agricultural cycle, the child would be returned to the earth during the next planting season. The sacrifice was ritualized, the child given poppy milk to ensure peaceful death, then buried alive in the field's center while still sleeping. The parents would cover their own child with soil, proving their commitment to the harvest above personal attachment. The child's cries from underground were interpreted as the earth waking for new growth. Communities that practiced grain baby sacrifice reported consistently better harvests in fields where children were buried. Modern soil analysis of these sites shows unusually high nitrogen content and other nutrients that would indeed improve crop yield, though whether this was from the bodies themselves or from other ritual additions to the soil remains debated. The psychological impact of communal participation in child sacrifice created a shared investment in agricultural success that went beyond normal concern for good harvest. The harvest season brought its own fertility rituals. The last sheaf of grain would be formed into a human figure called the Corn Mother, dressed in women's clothing and treated as a living being. Throughout winter, the Corn Mother would be kept in the house of whoever harvested the last grain. Men would sleep with it in their beds, performing acts with it that imitated procreation. By spring, the Corn Mother would be pregnant with new growth and would be burned in the fields to release the fertility back to the earth. Menstrual blood held special significance in Viking fertility magic. Women would synchronize their cycles through proximity and shared consumption of herbs, allowing entire communities of women to menstruate simultaneously. During their collective bleeding, they would walk naked through the fields, their blood dripping onto the soil. This blessing of blood was believed to be especially powerful, combining the life-giving force of women with the life-sustaining earth. The economic importance of fertility rituals cannot be overstated. Viking society depended on successful harvests for survival. Failed crops meant starvation, weakness that invited raids, inability to mount expeditions. The fertility rituals, however disturbing to modern sensibilities, represented massive community investment in agricultural success. Everyone participated, everyone contributed bodily fluids, everyone shared responsibility for the harvest's success or failure. The psychological techniques used in fertility rituals created altered states of consciousness that made participation possible despite natural reluctance. The drums, chants, and smoke from burning herbs contained mild hallucinogens. The collective nature of the rituals reduced individual responsibility. The religious framework transformed acts that would normally be considered shameful into sacred duties. Participants often reported entering trance states where they felt merged with the earth itself. Now we return to the center of Viking darkness, Seidr, the magic that required practitioners to violate every norm of their society. The word itself was dangerous. Calling someone a seidmaður, man who practices Seidr, was such a grave insult that it legally justified immediate lethal retaliation. Yet Seidr was also the most powerful magic in the Norse world, capable of prophecy, weather control, healing, cursing, and communication with the dead. The price for this power was complete transformation of identity, especially for men who chose to practice it. To understand Seidr, we must understand the Norse concept of gender and sexuality as it related to power. Vikings believed that being penetrated, whether physically or symbolically, fundamentally changed a person's nature. For women, this was considered natural and didn't diminish their essential identity. For men, it was transformation so profound that they ceased to be men in any meaningful sense. They became something else, not female, but a third category that Vikings recognized but despised. The training to become a Seidr practitioner began with systematic breaking of gender boundaries. Male apprentices would be forced to wear women's clothing for months, until moving in men's clothes became uncomfortable. They would be taught to speak in higher registers, to walk with feminine gaits, to gesture in ways that Vikings coded as female. This wasn't just external performance, but internalization of feminine behavior patterns until they became natural. The tools of Seidr were explicitly symbolic of this gender transformation. The Seithstaff, the sacred staff, was not just a magical implement, but a representation of the masculine principle that the practitioner would internalize. The positioning required for certain Seidr rituals made this symbolism literal. The practitioner would assume positions that Vikings considered fundamentally unmanning, allowing themselves to be opened to receive divine power. The chemical components of Seidr practice included substances that may have actually altered hormonal balance. Practitioners consumed extracts from plants that modern science recognizes as containing phytoestrogens. They applied oils that included compounds absorbed through skin that could affect secondary sexual characteristics. Over time, male Seidr practitioners would develop physical changes, redistribution of body fat, changes in body hair patterns, softening of features. Whether this was from the substances consumed or from other aspects of practice remains unclear. The actual practice of Seidr required entering altered states of consciousness that Vikings described as being ridden. The practitioner would become a vessel for spirits, gods, or forces that would use their body to manifest in the physical world. This possession was described in terms that explicitly paralleled sexual penetration. The practitioner had to be open, receptive, willing to receive. The language used was the same as that used to describe the feminine role in sexual intercourse. The most powerful Seidr rituals required multiple practitioners working together in ways that created collective consciousness. They would form circles, connected through physical contact and synchronized breathing. They would consume substances that contained compounds from each other's bodies: saliva, blood, sexual fluids. This biological mingling was believed to create temporary telepathic connections, allowing the practitioners to combine their power. The prophecies delivered through Seidr were remarkably accurate, suggesting either genuine supernatural insight or access to information networks that transcended normal communication. Seidr practitioners would enter trance states where they spoke in voices not their own, describing future events in detail that later proved exact. They revealed secrets that should have been unknowable. They located lost objects, missing people, and hidden treasures with precision that defied explanation. But prophecy was only one application of Seidr. Practitioners could curse enemies with afflictions that physicians couldn't cure. They could bless wombs that had been barren for decades. They could drive men mad with desire or revulsion. They could bring storms or sunshine, feast or famine, victory or defeat. The power was real enough that even those who despised Seidr practitioners feared to offend them. The social position of Seidr practitioners was paradoxical. They were simultaneously essential and despised, powerful and marginalized, feared and mocked. They lived on the edges of society, in liminal spaces between settlements. They were called upon in times of crisis, but shunned during normal life. They accumulated wealth through their services, but could never use it to achieve traditional status. They existed outside the normal social hierarchy, neither high nor low, but other. Female practitioners of Seidr, the vulva, held a different but equally complex position. While women weren't considered degraded by Seidr practice the way men were, they still faced transformation. The vulva had to maintain states of constant receptivity to spiritual forces. They would engage in rituals with multiple partners, human and otherwise, to gather the energy needed for their magic. They would use their bodies as conduits for forces that required specific physical preparations and practices. The economic structure around Seidr was sophisticated. Practitioners charged enormous fees for their services, but payment wasn't always in gold or silver. They might demand firstborn children, years of service, or participation in rituals that bound the client to the practitioner permanently. Some see their practitioners accumulated networks of individuals who owed them services, creating power bases that rivaled those of Jarls. The end of life for Sather practitioners was often unusual. Many were said to not truly die, but to transition to another state of existence. Their bodies would be found in positions suggesting they had been performing rituals at the moment of death. Some were discovered with objects inserted in ways that suggested they had been attempting to permanently merge with their magical tools. Others seemed to have deliberately chosen death through ritual practices that went too far. The influence of Sather on Viking culture went beyond individual practitioners. The concept that power could be gained through accepting transformation, even degrading transformation, created a framework where suffering became potentially valuable. This may have contributed to the Viking willingness to endure extremes in pursuit of goals, whether in exploration, warfare, or religious practice. The Blood Eagle wasn't merely execution. It was a theatrical performance that transformed human anatomy into a religious statement. The victim would experience every moment of their transformation from living being to altar decoration, kept conscious through careful technique and chemical assistance. While modern historians debate whether the Blood Eagle was real or a literary invention, archaeological evidence and consistent descriptions across multiple sources suggest it was genuinely practiced, though probably reserved for the most significant enemies. The preparation of a Blood Eagle victim began days before the actual execution. This wasn't to increase suffering, but to ensure the victim would survive long enough to experience the full ritual. They would be fed herbs that prevented shock, including willow bark, that managed pain just enough to maintain consciousness without providing relief. They would consume mushrooms that heightened sensory perception, making every sensation more intense. Most importantly, they would be given compounds that prevented blood clotting while maintaining blood pressure, allowing massive trauma without immediate death. The positioning of the victim was as important as the cutting itself. They would be placed face down on a specially constructed platform that held their body at specific angles. Their head would be elevated enough that witnesses could see their face throughout the procedure. Their arms and legs would be secured with enough slack to allow some movement. The struggling was considered part of the performance, proving the victim lived through their transformation. The first cut would run along the spine, carefully avoiding major blood vessels. The key was to separate skin from muscle without causing immediate fatal blood loss. The skin would be peeled back in two flaps, exposing the ribs beneath. This alone would cause agony beyond description, but the ritual had barely begun. The exposed ribs would gleam white through the blood, creating a visual that witnesses would never forget. The breaking of ribs required exceptional skill. Each rib had to be severed near the spine without damaging the organs beneath. Vikings developed specialized tools for this, narrow chisels designed to crack bone precisely. The sound of ribs breaking would echo across the execution ground, a rhythmic percussion that accompanied the victim's attempts to scream. Once broken, the ribs would be bent outward like wings, creating the eagle shape that gave the execution its name. The most extraordinary aspect was what came next. The lungs, normally protected by the ribcage, would be pulled out through the gaps between the spread ribs. Still connected to the respiratory system, they would continue to inflate and deflate, resembling wings attempting flight. The visual effect, pink lung tissue moving against white bone and red muscle, created an image that transcended simple execution into something approaching art. Salt would be rubbed into the wounds, not just for pain but for preservation and religious significance. The salt was believed to purify the sacrifice, making it acceptable to Odin. Sacred herbs would be burned, their smoke directed into the exposed lung tissue. As the victim breathed, they would inhale these substances directly into their bloodstream, entering altered states of consciousness that Vikings interpreted as divine possession. Witnesses reported that victims would begin speaking in tongues, not metaphorically, but literally vocalizing in ways that didn't sound human, Some claimed to hear prophecies of future events. Others said the victim spoke with voices of gods. Modern understanding suggests this was glossolalia, brought on by extreme trauma and psychoactive substances, but to Vikings it was proof that the blood eagle opened doorways between human and divine realms. The audience played an active role in blood eagle executions. They would throw offerings at the transformed victim, flowers for female gods, weapons for male gods, food for ancestors. These offerings weren't meant to increase suffering, but to be delivered to the divine realm through the portal created by the spread body. Children would be lifted to get better views, this being considered educational rather than traumatic. The blood eagle taught lessons about power, revenge, and the price of opposing Viking strength. Other execution methods revealed similar creativity in combining death with religious significance. Drowning in bogs wasn't simple killing, but marriage between victim and the sacred bog. The victim would be weighted with stones placed in specific locations: mouth, anus, genitals, that would keep the body positioned correctly as it sank. The bogs would preserve these bodies perfectly, creating galleries of executed criminals visible through dark water for centuries. The Walk to Valhalla execution involved forcing victims to fight increasingly impossible battles until death. They would begin fighting one warrior, then two, then three, with no rest between battles. The fights would continue until the victim died from wounds or exhaustion. This execution was reserved for enemy warriors who had shown exceptional courage. The extended death considered an honor that might earn them place in Valhalla despite being enemies. Burning executions involved more than simple immolation. Victims would be coated in different substances depending on their crimes. Oath-breakers would be covered in tar that burned slowly. Rapists would be coated in animal fat that burned hot and fast. Thieves would have their stolen goods melted onto their skin before the fire was lit. The type of burning communicated the nature of the crime to all witnesses. The tree marriage execution involved hanging victims from sacred trees, but not by the neck. They would be suspended by hooks through their backs, shoulders, or thighs, positions that allowed them to live for days. They would be fed by having food forced into their mouths, water poured over them during rain. The slow death was considered a wedding between the victim and the tree, their life force gradually transferring to the wood. The belief that humans could transform into animals wasn't metaphorical for Vikings. They developed elaborate rituals designed to facilitate actual transformation, or at least states of consciousness so altered that participants experienced themselves as animals. These shape-shifter cults went beyond the famous berserkers to include wolf warriors, boar warriors, and even raven mystics who claimed to leave their bodies and travel as birds. The Ulfathnar, wolf warriors distinct from berserkers, underwent initiations that required complete integration with actual wolf packs. Boys selected for this path would be abandoned in forests during winter, naked and without tools except a single knife. To survive, they had to be accepted by wolves, not metaphorically, but literally adopted into packs. This required transformation of behavior, scent, and consciousness that went beyond mere mimicry into something approaching actual species change. The process of gaining wolf acceptance began with scent transformation. The boys would roll in wolf droppings and urine until their human scent was completely masked. They would eat the same diet as wolves, raw meat, organs, and the partially digested vegetation found in prey stomachs. Over weeks, their body odor would change, becoming something neither human nor wolf, but compatible with pack recognition systems. The psychological transformation was even more profound. The boys had to learn to think in wolf concepts, dream in wolf experiences, process the world through wolf perception. This required not just observation, but complete immersion in wolf consciousness. They would learn the complex social communications of wolves, the ear positions, tail movements, vocalizations, and scent markings that conveyed specific information. They began processing this information automatically, responding to wolf communications without conscious thought. The chemical enhancement of shape-shifting involved compounds that modern science is only beginning to understand. Beyond the famous mushrooms, shape-shifters consumed glands from various animals, believing this would transfer animal characteristics. They would eat wolf brains for cunning, bear hearts for strength, raven eyes for sight. These organs would be prepared through fermentation processes that may have created psychoactive compounds, though the exact chemistry remains unknown. The rituals for transformation were elaborate and dangerous. A wolf warrior preparing for battle would begin days in advance. He would fast from human food, consuming only what wolves would eat. He would sleep in positions wolves used, curled tightly with nose to tail. He would avoid human speech, communicating only in growls and howls. By the time of battle, witnesses said they could no longer recognize the human in the creature before them. The physical changes reported during shape-shifting seem impossible, yet multiple independent sources describe similar phenomena. Bodies would grow additional hair during transformation. Jaws would extend. Teeth would seem to sharpen. Some accounts describe warriors dropping to all fours and moving with gaits impossible for normal human anatomy. While full physical transformation is impossible, extreme states of consciousness, combined with observer expectation, could create compelling illusions of transformation. The sexual behaviors of shapeshifters followed animal rather than human patterns. They would mate publicly, in groups, without regard for human taboos. They would mark territory with urine and feces. They would fight for breeding rights through physical dominance. In their transformed state, human social rules ceased to apply. This wasn't considered criminal but natural consequence of accessing animal consciousness. Female shapeshifters, though rarer, underwent different transformations. They often identified with birds, particularly ravens and swans. Their rituals involved sensory deprivation that created out-of-body experiences. They would be suspended in darkness for days, fed only liquids containing psychoactive compounds. When released, they would report experiencing flight, seeing the world from above, traveling vast distances instantly. Some claimed to spy on enemies from these aerial perspectives, returning with intelligence that proved accurate. The swan maiden tradition involved young women who would wear cloaks made from swan feathers while consuming preparations that created dissociative states. In these states, they would experience themselves as swans, complete with sensation of flight, different visual perception, and inability to speak human language. Some became so identified with swan form that they lost ability to function normally in human society, requiring constant care from handlers who understood their transformed nature. The boar warriors represented a different type of transformation. Rather than integrating with wild animals, they would undergo rituals that awakened what they believed was ancestral boar spirit inherited through bloodlines. These rituals involved consuming massive amounts of food, gaining weight rapidly, developing the bristling body hair and aggressive temperament associated with wild boars. In battle, they would charge without strategy, relying on mass and fury rather than skill. The Raven mystics claimed the most extreme transformations. They would undergo rituals involving suspension from trees, hanging from hooks through their backs in imitation of Odin's sacrifice. While suspended, they would consume substances that created near-death experiences. In these states, they claimed to leave their bodies entirely, their consciousness traveling in raven form to gather information, communicate with the dead, or witness events in distant locations. The depths of Scandinavian winter created conditions where normal social bonds strained and sometimes snapped entirely. Resources became scarce, isolation became absolute, and darkness seemed to press in from all sides. It was during these months that Vikings performed some of their most extreme rituals, ceremonies designed to ensure survival through winter and the return of spring. These winter sacrifices went beyond simple offerings to become elaborate performances that united communities through shared participation in necessary atrocities. The midwinter blot celebrated at the winter solstice, was the most important sacrificial ceremony of the year. But unlike the public spectacles of Uppsala, winter sacrifices were intimate affairs, taking place within communities where everyone knew both sacrificers and sacrificed. The selection of victims for winter sacrifice followed different logic than summer ceremonies. These weren't enemies or criminals, but community members whose death would serve the greater good. The practice of sacrificing the elderly during harsh winters was ritualized into something that transcended mere resource management. When food stores ran low and spring seemed impossibly distant, communities would hold ceremonies where the elderly would volunteer for sacrifice. The social pressure made refusal impossible, but the ritual framework transformed what could have been seen as murder into sacred duty. The preparation of elderly sacrifices involved weeks of ceremony that elevated their status while preparing them for death. They would be fed the best remaining food, seated in places of honor, consulted on all community decisions. Their memories would be formally recorded, their possessions distributed according to their wishes, their conflicts resolved. By the time of sacrifice, they had socially died, their earthly business complete. The actual sacrifice of the elderly took various forms, depending on regional tradition. In Norway, they would be taken to cliff edges overlooking the sea and encouraged to jump, their deaths feeding the ocean that would return as fish in spring. In Sweden, they would be left in forest clearings with ceremonial weapons, dying as warriors even if they had never fought. In Iceland, they would be sealed in ice caves with provisions for the journey to the afterlife, freezing slowly while potentially conscious. Children born with obvious disabilities faced similar fates during winter months when resources were scarce. But their deaths weren't hidden shame but public ceremony. The community would gather to witness the returning of these children to the gods who had sent them incomplete. The parents would be required to perform the sacrifice themselves, proving their commitment to community survival over personal attachment. The method for sacrificing disabled infants was precisely ritualized. They would be placed on frozen lakes or rivers, the ice serving as bridge between worlds. As the children froze, their cries were interpreted as messages to the gods about the community's needs. When silence came, it meant the message had been received. The bodies would be left on the ice until spring melt carried them away, returning them to the cosmic waters from which life emerged. Winter also brought the Hungry Month sacrifices, performed when starvation threatened entire communities. These ceremonies required the sacrifice of the most valuable community members, not the weak or elderly, but the young and healthy whose life force was considered most potent. The selection process was elaborate, involving divination, dreams, and sometimes voluntary submission by individuals who believed their death would save others. One account from Iceland describes a winter so harsh that a community of 200 faced starvation by February. The priests declared that only the sacrifice of a virgin would break the cosmic imbalance, causing the extended winter. They selected Gudrun, daughter of the most wealthy farmer, her value as sacrifice increased by her father's status. She was prepared for a month, fed mystical substances that supposedly transformed her from human to divine messenger. Gudrun's sacrifice took place on a frozen lake under the aurora borealis. The entire community gathered in concentric circles around her. She was dressed in white robes that would show blood dramatically against snow. The method of death was precise. Cuts that would bleed slowly, her life force seeping into the ice over hours. As she died, the community chanted, their breath creating clouds that seemed to carry her spirit skyward. Whether by coincidence or divine intervention, spring came early that year. The psychological impact of winter sacrifices on communities was profound. Everyone had participated in or witnessed the deaths of people they knew. This shared complicity created bonds that transcended normal social connections. Communities that sacrificed together stayed together, united by secrets that couldn't be shared with outsiders. The trauma of winter sacrifices became part of cultural identity, something that marked true membership in the community. The economic calculations behind winter sacrifices were ruthlessly practical. A community might survive losing its elderly, its disabled, even some of its young. It couldn't survive everyone starving. The sacrifices weren't just religious ceremonies, but mathematical solutions to resource scarcity. By sacrificing some, the remainder might live to see spring. This cold logic was dressed in religious significance to make it bearable. When Vikings encountered Christianity, they didn't simply oppose it. They systematically inverted and corrupted its ceremonies, transforming Christian sacraments into blasphemous rituals that attacked the new religion at its theological core. These weren't random acts of desecration, but carefully planned performances designed to demonstrate the superiority of Norse gods through the degradation of Christian symbols, spaces, and servants. The capture of monasteries provided Vikings with opportunities for elaborate anti-Christian ceremonies. Monks and nuns weren't simply killed but forced to participate in inversions of their own rituals. The Mass would be performed backward, with bodily fluids replacing wine and water. Crosses would be inverted and used in ways that violated both their sacred nature and the bodies of those who had worn them. Christian prayers would be rewritten to praise Norse gods, forcing priests to speak blasphemies in the languages they considered holy. One of the most detailed accounts comes from the raid on Lindisfarne in 793, where Vikings didn't just steal treasure, but conducted a 3-day ceremony that systematically corrupted every aspect of the monastery's sacred space. They began by slaughtering animals on the altar, letting blood flow over consecrated surfaces. They forced monks to consume meat on days of fasting, to drink themselves drunk on communion wine, to dance naked around bonfires built from holy books. The treatment of nuns revealed particular creativity in corruption. Their vows of chastity made them valuable for rituals that required virgin violation, but Vikings went beyond simple assault. They would force nuns to marry sacred trees or standing stones in ceremonies that parodied Christian marriage while wedding them to pagan nature worship. These marriages would be consummated in ways that destroyed both physical virginity and spiritual purity. Christian priests faced different but equally systematic corruption. They would be forced to perform baptisms using blood instead of water, to give communion with human flesh instead of bread, to hear confessions that described acts that violated every commandment. Some priests were kept alive for months, forced to perform increasingly blasphemous ceremonies until their minds broke from the conflict between their faith and their actions. The corruption of Christian holidays showed remarkable creativity. Christmas raids involved forcing Christians to worship trees decorated with human organs from their fellow believers. Easter ceremonies were inverted into celebrations of death rather than resurrection, with priests buried alive on Good Friday and dug up on Easter Sunday to be violated, while being told they had been reborn as pagans. Christian children captured in raids faced systematic re-education designed to corrupt their faith from within. They would be taught to pray to Norse gods using Christian prayer forms, to perform Christian rituals with pagan substitutions, to see their original faith as weak magic that had failed to protect them. These corrupted children would sometimes be returned to Christian communities as living examples of Norse power over the Christian God. The psychological warfare aspect of Christian corruption was precisely calculated. Vikings understood that Christianity depended on faith in divine protection. By systematically violating Christians and their sacred spaces without divine intervention, Vikings demonstrated that their gods were stronger. Every corrupted priest, every violated nun, every desecrated church was proof that the White Christ couldn't protect his followers. The Longhouse falls silent as dawn breaks. Eyjolf the Red has completed his transformation, emerging as something neither male nor female, neither fully human nor entirely other. The 40 witnesses file out in silence, bound by shared participation in ceremonies that have changed them all irrevocably. They will never speak of this night, but they will carry it forever, in dreams that surface without warning, in moments of unexpected arousal, in children who inherit behavioral patterns they never consciously learned. These rituals weren't aberrations in Viking culture, but fundamental expressions of a worldview that saw transformation, even degrading, violent, corrupting transformation, as pathways to power. Every major aspect of Viking society involved rituals that broke boundaries between human and animal, between living and dead, between sacred and profane, between individual and collective consciousness. The Vikings discovered something profound and terrible about human nature, that consciousness is far more malleable than we pretend, that the boundaries we consider absolute are actually arbitrary, that humans are capable of experiences and transformations that challenge the definition of humanity itself. They pushed these discoveries to their absolute extremes, creating a culture where the impossible became mandatory, where atrocity became worship, where degradation became divine. The archaeological evidence continues to surface, confirming what once seemed like Christian exaggeration or literary invention. Every excavation reveals new proof of practices that exceed what historians thought possible. The physical record won't let us forget, even as we try to sanitize Viking culture into something palatable for modern consumption. The bones marked by ritual trauma, the bog bodies preserved in positions of violation, the remnants of platforms built for ceremonies we can barely imagine, all testify to the reality of Viking darkness. The genetic legacy persists in ways science is only beginning to understand. Descendants of Vikings carry markers suggesting ancestral trauma so severe it altered gene expression. Epigenetic changes associated with extreme stress, systematic violence, and psychological transformation appear throughout Scandinavian populations. The Vikings literally bred their experiences into the human genome, creating an inheritance that can't be erased by historical revision. Modern Scandinavian culture's emphasis on equality, consent, and human dignity might represent a millennia-long reaction against ancestral practices. The cultures that once pushed human experience to its darkest extremes now lead the world in progressive values. It's as if collective cultural memory, even when consciously forgotten, drives societies away from their own historical darkness. But the capacity for such extremes didn't disappear. It waits in human potential, in the malleability of consciousness, in the ease with which social bonds can normalize atrocity. The Vikings showed us what humans can become when all boundaries dissolve, when violation becomes sacred, when community bonds depend on shared participation in necessary evil. They revealed capabilities that exist in every culture, waiting for the right combination of isolation, pressure, and belief to manifest. The Seidr, practitioners who sacrificed their gender identity for magical power, the berserkers who surrendered their humanity for battle prowess, the communities that sacrificed their children for agricultural success, the shapeshifters who lost themselves in animal consciousness, all represent prices paid for power that came through transformation. These weren't victims, but participants in a culture that had discovered transformation, even terrible transformation, as the source of power. We tell ourselves these were different times, different people, different values. But the psychological techniques Vikings used, trauma bonding, chemical consciousness alteration, systematic boundary violation, collective participation in atrocity, are understood now with scientific precision. The knowledge of how to transform human consciousness through extreme experience can't be undiscovered. It waits in textbooks on psychology, neuroscience, and pharmacology, available to anyone willing to apply it. The Viking rituals officially ended with Christian conversion, but nothing truly ends. It transforms, goes underground, emerges in new forms. The Scandinavian winter festivals that still involve masks and wild behavior echo berserker transformations. The summer solstice celebrations contain elements tracing back to fertility rituals. The reverence for nature that characterizes modern Nordic culture might be sanitized continuation of beliefs that once required human sacrifice to natural forces. In museums across Scandinavia, Viking artifacts are displayed with careful curation that emphasizes craft, trade, and exploration while minimizing the darkness that funded these achievements. The swords are shown, but not what they cut. The jewelry is displayed, but not how it was purchased with slave profits. The ships are celebrated, but not the human cargo they carried. We've collectively agreed to remember Vikings as brave explorers rather than practitioners of extremes that challenge our conception of human possibility. But forgetting doesn't erase. The 40 witnesses to Eyjolf's transformation took their secret to graves, but their children inherited unexplained anxieties, strange dreams, behavioral patterns with no clear origin. Their communities prospered from prophecies they couldn't acknowledge, fought battles with tactics derived from blood bonds they couldn't admit, survived winters through sacrifices they couldn't record. The entire culture depended on practices it couldn't officially recognize. The sagas that preserve Viking culture are remarkable as much for what they don't say as what they do. They use euphemisms, implications, and silences to gesture toward practices that couldn't be directly recorded. They preserve the shapes of rituals while obscuring their contents. They tell us that certain things happened while refusing to tell us what those things were. The silence itself becomes testimony to experiences that exceeded language's capacity to contain them. This is the true Viking legacy, not brave warriors and skilled sailors, but humans who discovered the absolute extremes of consciousness and made them sacred. They showed us what we're capable of when all restrictions disappear, when community bonds depend on shared violation, when power comes through transformation that destroys even as it empowers. They revealed aspects of human nature that we've spent 1,000 years trying to forget. The Seithstafr stands abandoned in the empty longhouse, waiting for the next practitioner desperate enough to pay its price. The platforms where blood eagles were performed lie buried under centuries of soil, but their shapes remain visible to those who know what to look for. The trees at Uppsala no longer bear human fruit, but the ground beneath them remains unusually fertile. The bog bodies wait in museums, perfectly preserved reminders of prices paid for community survival. Somewhere in Iceland, in Norway, in Denmark, in Sweden, there are people who dream of rituals they've never witnessed, who feel pulls toward practices they've never learned, who carry in their cells the memory of ancestors who discovered the darkest possibilities of human experience. The genetic echo of Viking darkness persists, waiting for recognition, for understanding, or perhaps for repetition under new names and justifications. The Vikings are gone, but what they discovered about human capability remains. It waits in our potential for transformation, in our capacity for extremes, in the ease with which communities can normalize atrocity through shared participation. They showed us the depths we chose to forget. But the depths remain, patient and eternal, waiting for the next culture to rediscover what should have stayed hidden. This is what the Vikings did in the darkness between their celebrated achievements. This is what funded their expeditions, powered their victories, sustained their culture. This is the price they paid for the power that let them reshape the medieval world. They discovered that humans could be transformed into weapons, that consciousness could be altered beyond recognition, that communities could bond through shared atrocity, that the boundaries we consider absolute are actually negotiable. The witnesses to these rituals created a conspiracy of silence that lasted centuries. They couldn't speak of what they had seen, done, enabled. But their silence speaks louder than words, creating gaps in the historical record that testify to experiences too extreme for documentation. The shape of their silence reveals the magnitude of what they witnessed. Modern practitioners of Norse paganism carefully reconstruct Viking rituals while consciously avoiding their darkest elements. They perform blots without blood, conduct seidr without transformation, celebrate fertility without violation. This sanitized practice might be necessary, but it also represents a fundamental disconnection from the reality of Viking spirituality, which was inseparable from extremes that modern ethics cannot accommodate. The question remains, what drove Vikings to develop such extreme practices? The harsh environment doesn't fully explain it. Other Arctic cultures didn't develop similar rituals. The warrior culture doesn't account for it. Other military societies maintained different boundaries. Something specific about Viking culture, perhaps the combination of isolation, cosmic worldview, and social structure, created conditions where extremes became not just possible but necessary. Perhaps it was their conception of transformation as the fundamental force of existence. The Norse cosmos was one of constant change. Ice becoming fire, giants becoming gods, humans becoming animals, living becoming dead and potentially back again. In such a worldview, refusing transformation might have seemed like refusing existence itself. The extremes of Viking rituals might represent the logical conclusion of a philosophy that saw transformation as sacred, regardless of its nature. Or perhaps it was their understanding of power as something that had to be taken through sacrifice, specifically sacrifice of identity, dignity, and humanity. The Sather practitioner sacrificing gender, the berserker sacrificing humanity, the blood-bonded warriors sacrificing individuality, all represent prices paid for powers that couldn't be obtained while maintaining normal human identity. The Vikings discovered that the greatest powers required the greatest sacrifices, and they were willing to pay prices that other cultures couldn't imagine. The economic success of Viking society depended on these extremes. The raids that brought wealth were powered by berserkers and blood-bonded warriors. The agriculture that sustained populations was ensured through fertility rituals. The navigation and planning that enabled expansion came through Sather prophecy. The social cohesion that allowed small populations to impact the entire medieval world was maintained through shared participation in rituals that bound communities through complicity. Remove the extreme rituals, and Viking success becomes inexplicable. This creates uncomfortable questions about the relationship between cultural achievement and cultural darkness. The Vikings who gave us advanced navigation, sophisticated poetry, complex legal systems, and democratic assemblies were the same people who practiced systematic human sacrifice, ritualized sexual violence, and community bonding through shared atrocity. The culture that produced the Eddas also produced the Blood Eagle. The society that developed the Thing Assembly also developed Sather transformation. We want to separate these elements, to claim the achievements while rejecting the darkness, but they were inseparable parts of a single cultural system. The extremes weren't deviations from Viking culture, but expressions of its core values. The rituals weren't perversions of Viking spirituality, but its most sincere manifestations. The transformations weren't corruptions of humanity, but attempts to transcend its limitations. This is the final lesson of Viking darkness, that human cultures are capable of normalizing absolutely anything through the right combination of belief, social pressure, and shared participation. The Vikings created a society where parents could sacrifice their children, where warriors could abandon their humanity, where entire communities could participate in atrocities, all while maintaining functional social bonds and even seeing these acts as sacred duties. The capacity to create such cultures didn't disappear with the Vikings. It waits in human potential, in our ability to normalize extremes, in the ease with which communities can be united through shared participation in necessary evil. Every society contains the seeds of its own potential darkness, waiting for the right conditions to germinate. The Vikings showed us what those conditions could produce. They pushed human experience to its absolute extremes and discovered that the extremes were further than anyone had imagined. They found the boundaries of consciousness, sexuality, violence, and spirituality, then systematically destroyed them all. They revealed capabilities we've spent a millennium trying to forget. But forgetting doesn't mean they've disappeared. The capacity for such extremes remains encoded in our potential, waiting in the shadows of consciousness for the right combination of pressure and permission to re-emerge. The Vikings discovered aspects of human nature that, once revealed, can never be fully re-hidden. They opened doors that can't be completely closed. In the end, the most disturbing Viking ritual might be our own selective memory, choosing to remember the warriors and explorers while forgetting the prices paid for their achievements. We wear their symbols without understanding their meaning. We celebrate their courage without acknowledging their atrocities. We've transformed history's most extreme culture into entertainment, completing a sanitization that might be the ultimate perversion of their legacy. The Longhouse stands empty now, its sacred platforms dismantled, its ritual implements destroyed or hidden. But the knowledge of what happened there persists, in archaeological remains, in genetic inheritance, in the collective unconscious of cultures descended from Vikings. The darkness waits, patient and eternal, a reminder of what humans can become when all boundaries dissolve. The ritual ends, the echoes remain, the darkness endures, forever. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.